I was 19 the first time. I understood that silence could be louder than screaming. It wasn't during a fight or a dramatic blow-up. It was a Tuesday night in Ohio, rain tapping against the bus stop glass. My phone at 7% and no replies. I had just finished a double shift at a diner off the interstate, grease still clinging to my clothes, hands sore from carrying plates that weren't mine. I texted my mother first, then my father, then my older brother, the one everyone called the responsible one. I needed a ride home. That was it. No emergency, no drama, just help. The messages delivered. The typing bubbles never came. I stood there watching cars pass, headlights smearing into long white streaks, realizing something I had avoided my whole life when I needed them. I was optional. Eventually I walked. 45 minutes in the rain, shoes soaked, dignity dissolving with every step. When I got home, my brother's car was in the driveway. Lights were on. Everyone was awake. No one asked where I'd been. No one apologized. My mom glanced up from the couch and said, "You should plan better," like the night was my failure. I went to my room, shut the door, and sat on the floor because the bed felt like it belonged to someone else. That night didn't break me. It clarified me. I started noticing patterns I had ignored for years. How my parents bragged about my brother's promotions, but called my college degree a backup plan. How my paycheck always somehow went toward family expenses while I was told independence builds character. How I was praised for being low maintenance, which really meant easy to neglect. I wasn't angry yet. Anger takes time. At first, there was only awareness. I began saving quietly, switching shifts, taking freelance work online after midnight. I stopped announcing my goals. I stopped asking for permission. I stopped expecting applause. I watched how Isaly's love was given to those who reflected my family's image, and how quickly it was withheld from anyone who didn't. People think revenge starts with rage. Mine started with spreadsheets, late nights, and a promise I made to myself while my socks dried over a heater. I will never again beg people to care about me. I didn't know then how far that promise would take me, or how much it would cost the people who assumed I'd always be there to absorb the weight they refused to carry themselves. The first real shift happened quietly, the way earthquakes do before anyone checks the news. I moved out without an argument, without a speech, without drama. Just boxes, a borrowed truck, and a one-bedroom apartment 3 towns away. I didn't ask for help. I didn't announce it on social media. I simply stopped being available. No more last-minute favors. No more unpaid, "Can you just help real quick?" projects. No more money transfers with vague explanations. At first, my family didn't notice. They assumed I was busy, that I'd circle back like I always did. Then the consequences arrived. The internet bill bounced. The shared streaming accounts logged out. My father called asking why the car insurance payment hadn't gone through. I told him calmly that I wasn't on that account anymore. There was confusion, then irritation, then the familiar attempt to guilt me. I didn't argue. I just repeated the truth. I'm handling my own life now. Around the same time, my career started moving. Nothing flashy, just steady progress. I landed a remote job with a startup that cared more about results than resumes. My weekends were mine. My money stayed where I earned it. For the first time, my fridge had food I liked. My walls were bare by choice, and my sleep wasn't interrupted by anxiety about someone else's expectations. That's when my family began to panic. Not because they missed me, but because the system no longer worked without me. My brother struggled. At work, once my quick edits and "just check this favor" stopped. My mother complained that holidays felt disorganized. My absence exposed how much invisible labor I had been providing all along. The calls increased. The messages softened, then sharpened. I was accused of changing, of being selfish, of forgetting where I came from. What they meant was I was no longer convenient. Revenge didn't look like shouting. It looked like boundaries enforced consistently. It looked like declining invitations without explanations. It looked like watching people underestimated me scramble to replace what they never valued. I didn't celebrate their stress. I simply refused to fix it. That restraint was the hardest part. There were nights I almost caved, fingers hovering over my phone, conditioned to smooth things over. But then I remembered that bus stop, the rain, the silence. Healing taught me something brutal and freeing. You don't owe access to people who only respect you when you're useful. My revenge wasn't destruction. It was detachment. And detachment, it turns out, is devastating to those who depend on your silence to maintain their comfort. The final moment came a year later, unannounced and unavoidable. My mother showed up at my apartment. No warning. Just a knock and a face worn down by worry that wasn't entirely about me. She talked fast, words spilling over each other, apologies tangled with complaints. She said things were harder now, that the family felt disconnected, that people were asking questions. She wanted things back to normal. I listened, really listened, and for the first time, I didn't feel responsible for her emotions. I told her I wasn't angry anymore, that I didn't hate anyone, but I also wasn't going back to being the glue. That held everything together while dissolving myself in the process. She asked what I wanted. The question stunned her when I answered. Honestly, peace, autonomy, respect, not promises, not gestures, real change that didn't require me to suffer quietly. She cried. I didn't fix it. That's when I understood the full shape of my revenge. It wasn't about punishment, it was about choosing myself so completely that there was no space left for manipulation. My life now is simple in the best way. Mornings start with coffee. I drink slowly. Work I'm proud of. Evenings that don't feel like recovery from emotional labor. My family still exists, but at a distance that keeps me intact. They learned, too late, that love withheld has consequences. Not explosive ones, quiet ones, permanent ones. If there's anything this story is meant to do, it's this. Remind you that walking away isn't weakness. It's clarity. And revenge doesn't have to be loud to be final. Sometimes the most powerful response is building a life so full, so grounded, so self-directed, that the people who once ignored you are left staring at the absence of someone they assumed would never leave. After that conversation with my mother, something unexpected happened. The noise stopped. Not immediately, not magically, but steadily, like a radio being turned down one click at a time. The calls slowed. The messages became cautious. For the first time in my life, no one was demanding access to me as if it were a right. That quiet created space, and in that space, I started discovering who I was without constant emotional interference. I redecorated my apartment slowly, intentionally. Plants by the window, art on the walls that didn't need approval. I stopped explaining myself at work, stopped apologizing for competence. My confidence didn't arrive in a dramatic glow-up moment. It grew in small, almost boring decisions. Saying no to unpaid overtime. Negotiating my salary instead of accepting the first offer. Letting emails sit unanswered until business hours. I realized how deeply I had been trained to overperform in exchange for scraps of validation. Once that training broke, everything shifted. Meanwhile, my family struggled to adapt to a reality where I wasn't available to absorb stress. My brother called one night, voice tight, asking if I could just look over something real quick. I told him I no longer did free work. He laughed like it was a joke. Then he realized it wasn't. The silence that followed felt heavier than any argument we'd ever had. My father tried a different tactic, inviting me to dinner like nothing had happened. I declined politely. No explanation. That boundary hit him harder than confrontation ever could, because it meant I wasn't fighting to be understood anymore. I had already moved on. Friends noticed the change before I did. They said I seemed calmer, more grounded. I slept better. I laughed easier. My body stopped bracing for impact every time my phone buzzed. I began mentoring younger coworkers, people who reminded me of myself years earlier, eager, capable, and unsure if they were allowed to take up space. I told them what I had learned the hard way. Loyalty that costs you your well-being is not loyalty, it's conditioning. The more stable my life became, the clearer it was how chaotic my old role had been. I wasn't missed for who I was missed for what I provided. Once that supply ended, so did the illusion of unconditional love. That realization hurt, but it also healed. Because you can't fix a system designed to benefit from your silence. You can only leave it. And leaving doesn't require permission. It requires resolve. Every day I chose myself. I reclaimed a piece of energy I had spent years giving away for free. That accumulation became power. Quiet power. The kind that doesn't announce itself but changes everything. The longer I lived outside my family's expectations, the more clearly I could see how generational the problem was. Control passed down, disguised as care. Obligation mistaken for love. Silence rewarded. Independence punished. I started therapy not because I was broken, but because I wanted language for what I had survived. Naming things was transformative. Emotional neglect, parentification, conditional affection. Once named, they lost their grip. I wasn't defective. I had adapted to dysfunction. That distinction changed everything. I stopped replaying old conversations in my head, imagining better responses. There was nothing left to prove. My life spoke for itself. Financial stability came next. Not overnight, but steadily. Emergency fund. Retirement account. Savings untouched by anyone else's needs. That alone felt revolutionary. No one could pull the rug out from under me anymore. Holidays became simpler. Sometimes lonely, yes, but honest. I spent them with friends, chosen family, people who asked how I was and waited for the answer. My family still sent invitations, but they were different now. Careful, guarded, as if they finally understood that I could say no and mean it. That shift altered the power dynamic permanently. I noticed how often people try to rewrite history when consequences arrive. My mother framed her behavior as doing her best. My brother called the past misunderstandings. My father preferred silence, hoping time would erase accountability. But healing taught me that forgiveness doesn't require amnesia. You can't acknowledge growth without reopening wounds. You can wish people well without re-entering unsafe dynamics. That's what I chose. Distance without hostility. Contact without access. My revenge wasn't about making them suffer. It was about refusing to suffer quietly anymore. And that refusal forced them to confront parts of themselves they had avoided for decades. Some rose to the challenge. Others didn't. That wasn't my responsibility. The most unexpected outcome was how my story resonated with others. Coworkers confided similar experiences. Friends admitted they envied my boundaries. I became proof that walking away doesn't mean failure. It means discernment. The world doesn't end when you stop performing for approval. It expands. I stopped measuring success by how useful I was to others and started measuring it by how peaceful I felt at night. That metric never lied. If revenge has a final form, this was it. Living well, visibly, unapologetically, without asking permission from people who once controlled the narrative of my worth. Today, my life is steady in a way that once felt impossible. Not perfect, not flashy, but aligned. I wake up without dread. I make decisions without fear of backlash. I trust myself. That trust was the real prize all along. My family still exists in the background. Quieter now, less certain of their authority. Occasionally, my mother sends messages that hint at regret without fully naming it. I respond when I want to, not because I feel obligated. My brother keeps his distance. My father pretends everything is fine. I no longer need them to change for my peace to remain intact. That's the difference. When people lose control over you, they often call it distance. I call it freedom. I don't tell this story to villainize anyone. I tell it because silence protects systems that harm quietly. Because so many people think loyalty requires self-abandonment. Because walking away is still treated like betrayal instead of survival. My revenge wasn't explosive. It didn't trend. It didn't end with applause. It ended with something far better: autonomy. If you're reading this and wondering whether it's possible to leave without burning everything down, it is. You don't owe closure to people who never gave you safety. You don't owe access to people who only respect you when you comply. You don't owe your future to anyone who treated your past like it didn't matter. The most radical thing I ever did wasn't confronting them. It was choosing myself consistently, quietly, and without apology. That choice rewrote my life, and it will rewrite yours too if you let it. As time passed, I noticed something strange happening inside me. The anger I once thought I needed to survive was slowly dissolving. Not because what happened was suddenly okay, but because anger had done its job. It had protected me long enough to build distance, clarity, and strength. Now it was stepping aside. In its place came discernment. I became sharper about who I let close, who got access to my time, my energy, my vulnerability. I stopped oversharing to feel safe. I stopped explaining my boundaries to people who benefited from crossing them. I realized that my family wasn't the only place where I had learned to shrink. That training had followed me into friendships, workspaces, even romantic connections. So I began unlearning it everywhere. I practiced saying no without softening it. I practiced letting people be disappointed without rushing to fix it. At first, it felt selfish. Then it felt unfamiliar. Eventually, it felt normal. That was growth. I started to notice how often people mistake consistency for coldness when they're used to exploiting. Flexibility. Some relationships fell away naturally. Others deepened because they were built on mutual respect instead of obligation. I became less reactive, more intentional. When my family tried to pull me back into old dynamics with guilt-laced messages or nostalgic memories, I didn't bite. Nostalgia is dangerous when it edits out harm. I learned that you can honor the good without sacrificing yourself to the bad. The biggest change, though, was internal. I no longer needed my family to validate my pain. I believed myself. That belief was unshakable. It meant their denial no longer destabilized me. Their minimization no longer made me question my memory. I had proof in my nervous system, in my bank account, in my peace. I wasn't surviving anymore. I was building. And building requires focus. There was no room for emotional chaos disguised as love. I invested in my future the way I once invested in everyone else. Slowly, carefully, with intention. And every time I chose myself, the distance between who I was and who I used to be grew wider. That distance wasn't loss. It was progress. My family felt it too, whether they admitted in it or not. They could no longer access me through urgency, fear, or obligation. They had to meet me as an adult with boundaries. Some tried, some didn't. Either way, I stayed grounded. The girl who once waited for replies that never came was gone. In her place stood someone who no longer waited to be chosen. One evening, months later, I ran into someone who knew my family well. An old neighbor, the kind who had watched everything but said nothing. She smiled awkwardly and told me my parents talked about me often, that they didn't understand why I was so distant, that they missed me. I nodded politely. I didn't correct her. I didn't explain. I had learned that clarity doesn't always require conversation. Sometimes it requires acceptance. People will believe whatever protects their version of the story. I no longer felt the urge to challenge that. My truth didn't need witnesses anymore. Walking away had taught me something most people never learn. You don't heal by being understood by those who hurt you. You heal by understanding yourself enough to stop chasing their approval. That realization changed how I moved through the world. I stopped romanticizing reconciliation. I stopped hoping for dramatic apologies. I stopped waiting for the day my family would suddenly become who I needed them to be. Waiting keeps you stuck. Acceptance sets you free. I accepted that my parents loved me in the only way they knew how, and that it wasn't enough. Both could be true. That acceptance didn't excuse their behavior. It simply released me from trying to fix it. The power shift was complete. I was no longer reacting to my past. I was responding to my present. When I thought about revenge now, it didn't feel sharp or triumphant. It felt quiet, almost gentle. My success wasn't about proving them wrong. It was about proving myself right. Right about my worth. Right about my instincts. Right about leaving when staying required self-erasure. I stopped checking whether they noticed my absence. I stopped measuring my healing by their discomfort. Healing isn't performative. It doesn't require an audience. The more whole I became, the less relevant their opinions felt. I built traditions that didn't include obligation. Friend dinners, solo trips, mornings without anxiety. These weren't distractions. They were foundations. I realized that revenge stories don't have to end with the other side losing everything. Sometimes they end with you gaining everything they convinced you'd never have without. Stability, peace, self-trust, those are things no one can take from you once they're earned, and they're far more threatening to toxic systems than anger ever was. If there's an ending to this story, it isn't dramatic. There's no final confrontation, no public apology, no cinematic closure. There's just me, living a life that finally feels like mine. That's the part no one prepares you for. The quiet after survival. The stillness after constant vigilance. It can feel unfamiliar, even uncomfortable at first, but then it becomes sacred. I don't wait for my phone to buzz anymore. I don't flinch when it does. I don't measure my value by how needed I am. I measure it by how at peace I feel when no one needs anything from me at all. My family remains who they are, changed in some ways, unchanged in others. I wish them well from a distance that keeps me safe. That distance is not punishment. It's protection. The girl who once walked home in the rain has grown into someone who would never abandon herself that way again. That is the real revenge. Choosing yourself when it would be easier to return to what's familiar but harmful. Trust in your memory when others rewrite history. Building a life so full that the people who once overlooked you can no longer define you. If you see yourself in this story, know this: you are not dramatic for leaving. You are not cruel for choosing peace. You are not broken for needing distance. Sometimes, the bravest thing you can do is stop explaining why you deserve better and start living like you already know it. Revenge doesn't always look like destruction. Sometimes, it looks like freedom. And freedom, once claimed, doesn't need to be defended. It simply exists.